Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, in which we discuss a myriad of imaginary things, including books, film, comics, and more. So, today we are going to talk about magic.
Indeed we are.
And my name is Kendra, and my co-host today is Tony.
And every day.
And every day. Not every day of the week, but every day we do a podcast.
And every day of the week.
We live narrate each other's lives as we go about them.
I won't admit to that.
That is magical. Yeah, okay. But we're going to structure this conversation around two central questions. What does magic have to have in order to be satisfying? And the flip side of that, when does magic become problematic? So, Tony, let's launch into this conversation with some positives for once.
Yes.
Because we are definitely, sometimes we're sad Sallies.
So, a little bit.
A little bit. So let's talk about some of our favorites. What are some, just throw out a couple of books or television shows or movies where the magical system is profoundly satisfying to you?
Yes. Well, I would say, first off, there are two properties that I would like to recognize. They're both book series. The first is Garth Nix's Old Kingdom series of books, and the second is Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicles. And sidebar, I assume that the reason why it's called Kingkiller Chronicles will be in the third book, because there is no good reason for it in the first or second, and I don't really like that name anyway. But
you've hit the nail on the head insofar as one of the primary objections to this series that I hear from critics, which is that for a series titled The Kingkiller Chronicles, there's not an awful lot of king killing.
There's no kings. There's zero no kings in the first two books.
I should say there are no kings. Not there is no king.
There's no kings. Anyway, so
there be no kings.
But before I start off complaining about this book series, I should say the reason why I picked those two out is that I really, really like the way that magic is treated in both of them. And in fact, it's treated in very different ways. And I think that those two ways are kind of indicative of what I look for in magical systems in order for them to be satisfying for me.
Okay, we'll dig into that a little bit, though.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
What is the subtlety there that makes it so satisfying?
Yes. So in the Old Kingdom, what I really like about it is that you have a very clear description, without getting into too much nitty-gritty, of how exactly the magical system is established. You have free magic, you have charter magic, you have places where free magic doesn't exist and only charter magic exists. You have sort of, by way of mythology and so forth, the way that charter magic was born from free magic. You even get kind of an origin story where magic comes from, and it plays a part in the three, well, I guess it's now 5 main books of the Old Kingdom series. So, that's one way to do it. And then what I really like about The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, aka The Kingkiller Chronicles, is that it's both very clearly explicated what exactly magic, or in the case of those books, sympathy, is, as well as how you do it, and how characters come to be proficient at it, how they learn it, how they utilize it. But there's still just a little twist of is it really as simple as holding what you want to do so clearly in your mind, and isn't there more to it? And characters ask questions like these, and I think that's one of the strengths of the books, that characters are like, wait a minute, how exactly does this work, and then is that exactly how it works? And one final point about Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear is that we also get some elbow rubbing between magic in that universe and physics. Magic still has to obey the laws of conservation of energy, and I think other conservation laws, mass, momentum, I forget exactly which ones they say specifically, but I think conservation of energy gets a specific mention. And I really appreciate that, because it's finding a really cool way to have science in the world you see characters involved in scientific disciplines that we would recognize, like chemistry, and those we wouldn't recognize, like alchemy. I mean, that we would recognize, but without it being an actual thing. At the same time, and in the same place as they're studying magic. So I thought that's really cool. But those are two that I would definitely call out as some of my favorite representations. What would you say are your most satisfying magics?
Well, I would say that the Kingkiller Chronicles also makes my top 5. I do have some issues with this series as a whole that bump it down a couple of notches. Especially, I do feel that the first book was the strongest showing of the two. And I'm just a little hesitant. I am suspending judgment until that third book arrives, which may or may not be the last book in the series.
Which may or may not be this decade.
Which may or may not be this century. Actually, I do believe, having followed Patrick Rothfuss on Twitter for a while, he posts updates on his progress. He has a sort of progress bar. And he has completed, I believe, the first draft or something along those lines. So progress has been made. But if he has only gotten it to that stage now, then it's probably a good 2 years before we see the next book. That's pretty standard publication process. So in terms of series that I find enjoyable that you haven't touched on yet, or maybe not even series, standalone texts, pretty much anything from Neil Gaiman. And I'm thinking the full gamut from American Gods to Stardust. Because the way magic works in a Neil Gaiman universe is wacky and weird, and it does combine the sort of atmospheric magic, which in some senses could be compared to the free magic in the Aporson series, where it's part of the universe. It's just there. People don't question it. People don't structure it. It's just there. But then there are also in certain of his books structured and ritualized magics as well, which correspond more with the charter magic in the Aporson series. So there is a certain play between that atmospheric and ritualized magic that I find really interesting and really, really satisfying in a rambunctious, galumphing, adventuresome context like every Neil Gaiman book known to man. So he's definitely high on my list in terms of authors who produce works with magic in it. And there are texts which include magic, which are really foundational to my childhood, and I can't claim otherwise than that they had a profound influence on how I receive and perceive magic.
Yes.
Of course, a lot of our listeners will already be familiar with some of those texts: the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and a lot of them fall into the category of high fantasy or works in which magic is the world and the universe, but it's not necessarily an art form or a ritualized magic. So that's where I come from. And that's important to me to recognize. But in general, I wouldn't say that I have a clear runaway favorite in terms of magic worlds. I have a loose collection of books and films that keeps circling back around. There's even some comics that make it onto my list, like Fables, which are just wonderful. And I would even argue that Shudder has magic elements. So don't trust me to have a neat and clear top 5 in like a prioritized order.
I won't trust you.
You don't trust me. But I think it's worth talking a little bit about these Golden Age, traditionally fantastical magic worlds, as opposed to some of the more inventive and possibly more recent. There is a correlation, but it's not strict between those two things that we could talk about a little bit.
Yeah, and I want to just throw out a couple of other examples I thought of while you were talking that I think are particularly well done or were foundational for me. Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, for example, the names of things. And I know she wasn't the first one to do that, and she wasn't the only one to do that, but it stands for me as the example of names holding magical power the best. and if we're going
Because
to
actually, I think of the name of the wind when I think
right,
of that.
totally. I agree.
Huh.
But I, partly because it's right there in the title, but
Right.
also it reminds me of Earthsea. Like when I hear that names have
Sure.
power, things can be controlled with their true names. Like magic is partially learning the true names of things. I go immediately to Earthsea.
And I have to admit, I've only read one Earthsea novel. I've read a lot of Le Guin.
Yes.
But I have not read Earthsea in its entirety.
The last thing I want to, the last series I want to mention before we move on to thinking about maybe some things that don't work so well, is Terry Pratchett and Discworld.
Oh, yeah.
Again, we have an intermingling of magic and science done very tongue-in-cheek, done very satirically, which is, I think, why it works so well. When you started mentioning Neil Gaiman and the playfulness of magic, and even the ridiculousness of magic, I was like, oh, we can't but talk about Terry Pratchett, at least to say, yeah, good on you. One thing I think that does unite all of the books and the movies and the comics that we've mentioned so far is that magic is part of the background of the universe. And maybe we do get something like in the Old Kingdom series about how that magical universe came to be, the origin of magic, or not, as in most of the other
Right, like
series
Stardust
that we
has
talked about.
no explanation of where the magic comes from. It's just there. American Gods includes a little bit more of an examination. Narnia has a very explicit origin story for its magics. Lord of the Rings does too, if you read the enormous back volumes, the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth 1 to 12. All of those texts do include the backstory, but within the Lord of the Rings itself, the origin of magic, I don't think is discussed. So, yeah.
Well, here's my question for both of us.
Okay.
Is that, does magic have to be part of the background of a universe, whether it's explained or not, in order for that magical system to be satisfying?
I don't think it has to be. I think it's hard to create a world, or perhaps it's just rare at this point to receive a text wherein magic is not a part of the background. I mean, I can't really think of a text that doesn't have it there. I think I can think of several texts where the background noise, the cosmic background radiation of magic is pretty much all the magic you get. In fact, I would say that the Annihilation and the other Southern Reach books from, we've talked about them before on this podcast, that series is pretty much heavily reliant on what I would call background magic. But it's not calling it out as magic and so on and so forth. So you can argue with me on that point. But I do think it's unusual to have people do performative or ritualized magic without it also being a part of the background. I would be excited to discover a text which is the origin story of magic coming into a world that's not a direct analogy for, like, the creation story as shown in the the Bible, the Christian Bible, because currently the only one that leaps to mind as an origin story for magic, really, in terms of semi-contemporary fantasy, is Narnia. And that is so very clearly analogous to Christian scriptures.
Yeah.
So it would be exciting for me to read a new text that did something in that vein, but I don't think it's common.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's kind of, that wasn't really the question I should have asked. I will get to the question that I should have asked, but I think it's useful to think about the Southern Reach trilogy. This is Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance by Jeff VanderMeer. If you haven't checked them out. We will probably devote an entire podcast to them, but just know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to disagree with you that they're magic directly, but what I will say, and this makes me think of the Dystopia podcast, in terms of, like, defining what exactly magic is, and it's difficult to do. Like, I would group Southern Reach more in with, like, China Mieville and, like, you know, in the vein of Lovecraft even, as, like, weird fiction or horrific fiction, more so than, like, fantasy fiction. Even though it is fantastical, I wouldn't really describe what's going on in the Southern Reach as magical. And I think that that's an important distinction for me. So I don't disagree with you, but I think that when I think of magic...
do, and that's fine. I appreciate this conversation about, like, what is and isn't magic, and I hope we circle back to it, because it sounds like you treat magic like a genre, and that isn't entirely how I treat magic. Yeah. So now that I've got that straight in my head, I understand a little bit more where you're coming from. Carry on. Cool.
So I'm going to rephrase the question that I asked to, which do you find more satisfying? And it doesn't this isn't an either or type of a question, even though I'm phrasing it that way. But do you find more satisfying those books and series that treat magic as kind of a background noise thing? So it's there, characters use it, maybe they learn a little bit about it, but it's never, in terms that we've used before on this podcast, it's not exactly one of the novums of the book. It's not one of the central new conceits. And I'm borrowing that from our discussions of science fiction, but I think we could use it here as well. Or do you find something that's more like the Old Kingdom books or the Kingkiller Chronicles, where magic is something that characters really think about and get into, as far as, like, where it came from, how to learn it, where it developed, etc. More questions like those. Which do you generally prefer, and why?
You know, I think the triad, me, background only, and background plus ritualized magic worlds all exist in a very messy polyamorous relationship, because
yes, for sure.
I mean, because they do all bleed over into each other, and that's part of the pleasure for me, is reading both and enjoying both. I have to say, when I came across the Kingkiller Chronicles, that was something new for me in my college days. It was something that I hadn't seen a lot of, which is the intensive examination of what it's like to learn a new techno-magic, in a sense.
Yes.
And it was extremely pleasurable to encounter that for the first time. Afterwards, I've come across it, or similar things in other texts. I did not read a lot of fantasy as a child, in part because of the parental controls. So a lot of my reading in that genre has come in the college and post-college years. So it all feels somewhat new to me, but, you know, my background was in a pretty, you know, faith-based fantasy. So I really enjoyed it as something that I hadn't seen before, and I do believe that there might have been other authors who preceded Rothfuss in that vein, but he distilled it down to something really, for lack of a better word, magical, in that the distillation of scientific principles into a ritualized magic or performative magic was something that I find revolutionary, because it gives us free reign. It's essentially opening up the doors of fantasy and all of these subgenres that have been somewhat allergic to hard science. It's opening up the doors to, like, STEM programming in fantasy world number 34.
Yes.
And I don't think we'd have as much weird science fiction and weird fantasy if it hadn't have been for Patrick Rothfuss. So that is kind of where I fall down. I think I think of it as important, and all of it is good.
So one of the things that I'm wondering about, because of this sort of, like, polyamorous dance between fantasies and different kinds of fantasies, and how important magic is in those fantasies, and, like, whether technology can be in magic and fantasy. And anyway, so have you read G. Willow Wilson's A Leaf the Unseen?
So my answer to this is complicated, because I have held A Leaf the Unseen in my hands on multiple occasions. The first of which was when I visited you in Tucson in September.
Yes.
The second of which was when I purchased it from an independent bookstore in Missoula last weekend. So I have yet to completely read the whole thing. I have read the first chapter when I had some spare time in Tucson, but I have not completed it. And I will also say that I have a passing familiarity with G. Willow Wilson as an author and as especially a comic author. Her involvement in the Miss Marvel series blew my mind. Everyone, if you haven't read Miss Marvel, about Kamala Khan becoming Miss Marvel, it is perhaps the most inclusive, big-hearted, creative, funny new comic out there. It's just amazing. I love what she's done with the character, and I love the confluence of ideas and inclusivity and welcoming of diversity. I mean, it's everything that America isn't right now, which is somewhat sad, but it's also a picture of everything that America could be. And I think that's beautiful. So I owe G. Willow Wilson quite a few days of good feeling.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Leaf the Unseen, and I won't spoil it too much for you, but there are two reasons that I bring it up now. First reason is that it seems like this productive entangling of magic, in this case, magical beings, with technology. So basically, genies or demons in computers. And that's a terrible that is a really rough and really awful summary of it. It is much more than that. But for the purposes of this particular podcast and getting it in a sentence or less, I mentioned it in a second way because I think that when I default to thinking of magic, I tend to think of high fantasy. And high fantasy, coming from Lord of the Rings and, manifested as the Kingkiller Chronicles or Earthsea, or even, going so far as to include things like the Old Kingdom books or Harry Potter or the Oz books by L. Frank Baum and many others. But, what high fantasy is really kind of like a strictly Western genre, as far as I know. And so G. Willow Wilson was doing something that was, definitely for a Western audience, but was involving some more ideas in fantasy than I was typically exposed to, and I really liked it for that reason. And that made me think for this podcast, in what contexts do we find magic outside of the Western world? And I went immediately to video games for this because I am a Nintendo player, so I immediately thought of the Fire Emblem games, of the Tales series of games, of the Legend of Zelda, and all of which are Japanese games, but definitely are for a worldwide audience, if not specifically a Western audience. And so I think a lot of it is, sort of filtered through that lens. Like, what sorts of magical spells can characters use? We don't get a whole lot that's necessarily new, but it did make me think about magic around the world, contemporary magic around the world. What sorts of thoughts do you have about that?
Well, first of all, I have very complicated feelings about calling high fantasy a Western legacy, in a sense. In part because the texts which we have selected as the high fantasy canon might be Western in origin, but that doesn't mean that other texts aren't out there. They're just not being welcomed. High fantasy has been policed and canonized by white men, probably white middle-class men of Western extraction. That doesn't mean that women weren't writing high fantasy. It doesn't mean that people of color weren't writing high fantasy. It doesn't mean that high fantasy wasn't being written and consumed in droves overseas. It's just the texts which we tend to think of, like our snap judgment, like our Jeopardy go-tos are Lord of the Rings and all of these other texts which have been written by actually even like Protestant or Catholic Christian middle-aged white middle-class men. So I have complicated feelings about that because it's just that we haven't gotten around to excavating the past for some of these more interesting and diverse texts, like we are doing currently with some of our other genres. So right now, I think science fiction especially is doing a fantastic job of welcoming back more diverse texts. And it's still almost criminal how few of these diverse texts make it into the canon of great science fiction as policed and patrolled by Westerners. But it's better. It's doing better. Progress has been made. And I think you've actually touched on the pivot to our second question for me, which is, when does magic become problematic? Because so often magic and magical worlds fetishize and exoticize other cultures, non-Western cultures. And I'm thinking specifically of The Horse and His Boy, one of the books in the Chronicles of Narnia series, in which it's essentially the most superficial and stereotypical depiction of a Arabian, I guess Arab world and its magics. It's extremely racist and reductive and problematic, and all of the Narnia books have elements of that simplistic approach to other cultures in them. Narnia is not alone in that, and I would even argue that Tolkien had some of the same tendencies. It's just that his great, wonderful, noble cultures all happened to resemble British and Irish and Viking cultures, whereas his evil orcs and traitorous races all happen to resemble people of color. Magic becomes problematic when it's a tool that reinforces our othering and our exoticizing and our fetishizing of other cultures that are non-Western, non-white, non-heterosexual, etc. So, I don't know. Did I make a complete mess out of your question?
No.
Or am I still somewhat on track?
No, you're still on track. And I think that is really interesting to think about because that's true. Like, I can think of basically, like, easily 10 straight white guys who have written what's considered canonical, really important fantasies, really important books of magic. And it's kind of hard for me to think of anyone else. And that's not true specifically of fantasy and books that include magic, but it's easier in, like, science fiction for me to think of others who do it.
It is. And Le Guin is the woman who's the exception to the rule for me. She leaps to mind easily, but she also straddles the border between magic and science fiction, and usually I think of her in respect to her work in science fiction because I've read more of it.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, it's easy to think of the white men. It's not that the women and the people of color aren't there. It's just what's been canonized, what's been agreed upon by us to be the canon of fantasy seems to be predominantly boring.
Yes. And I want to give, before we move on here, shout-outs to two authors who are writing now, the books of whom I have read recently, N.K. Jemisin and Kij Johnson. N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. 2 of those books are currently out. The third one will be coming out in August of this year. But it's something that I wanted to bring up on the podcast very briefly, just to say, is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? Is it both? Who cares? It's well written and it's fun. And we will do another podcast solely devoted to those books in the future. But I want to recognize her, not only because she's a fantastic writer, she has many books out, but she also won the Hugo last year. And Kij Johnson, The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, which we will also talk about on the podcast. But I mentioned that specifically in reference to that earlier thought about what magic is, what sort of genre magic might be for me, for example. And I sort of like lumped Southern Reach, China Mieville, Lovecraft in together. What Kij Johnson does in the dream quest of Velvet Bow is to reinvent a sort of Lovecraftian universe, but one that is told from the perspective of a middle-aged woman and sort of responds to the sexism and the racism that she remembers as a girl reading Lovecraft, but, sort of like doesn't want to remember that. Like, how do you do a feminist, non-racist retelling or revisiting of some of these ideas? So sure. I'm actually really excited about some of the work that's going on right now, for sure.
Well, and I think there are texts that do a really successful job, for the most part at least, in tackling this fetishizing impulse head on. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to give a shout out to the makers of Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, because even though all of the fandom and sort of peripheral texts which have been inspired by or influenced by Avatar often fall into the same trap of fetishizing as the other texts we've criticized earlier, mm-hmm. Avatar itself, for the most part, did a really good job of being sensitive to its influences mm-hmm. and really seeking out people from source cultures in real Earth history that are aligned with the cultures in Avatar in some way, shape, or form. Pulling on people who are experts in the field to inform and shape what happens on screen. I can remember some fantastic breakdowns of what the magic styles in Avatar: The Last Airbender mm-hmm. draw upon in terms of different martial arts.
Yes.
And I thought that was really thought-provoking and interesting mm-hmm. and just straight up thoughtful and wonderful in the way that they were sensitive to that. Yeah. I think that perhaps the reason why Avatar became a thing might have been problematic. Like, we need another text in which we adventure through a vaguely Central Asian world in which everyone's doing martial arts. Like, that could very easily become another Karate Kid kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, the actual execution of the show was really great. So shout out to Avatar. Thank you for existing. Legend of Korra, thank you for being queer. I love you.
Avatar and Korra work on so many levels, and I will... we can talk about them in another podcast and appreciate them endlessly, because we do. But I want to just say, before we move on to the next thing, that to see the ways in which Avatar and Korra could have gone really, really wrong, you need to look no further than the movie of Avatar, which was a train wreck on every level, but especially in how it handled its casting, how it handled its presentation of the... air quotes, cultures that were supposed to be, fictional and in-universe, and it just did a terrible, terrible job of representing on screen a thing that had been handled with such deftness on screen already.
Yeah, note to directors and producers, when you're going through the casting process, it's generally not a good idea to cast all of your heroes as white people in blackface or pretending to be people of color, and then have the only actual person of color in your film be the villain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not good. That's not sensitive. That's not kind. That's not remotely like the origin text, which I know that creative license is a thing, but still, you're betraying the core of what the original show was about. So yeah, I have a lot of angry feels about the Avatar movie, mm-hmm. and actually Avatar movies, because the Blue Aliens film also inspires interesting feelings. However, back to the point, whitewashing was not a term I heard before Avatar, the film adaptation. And I suppose, if anything, I can be grateful to Avatar, the film version, for taking that conversation about whitewashing mainstream. They changed the conversation amongst audiences at that point, and it has led to actual tangible results in the somewhat nearer past. I'm thinking of several films that were successfully boycotted mm-hmm. as a result of the whitewashing of the cast. Mm-hmm. And so that's, I think what happened after Avatar was important, but it took Avatar to get us to a place where we were like, oh yeah, this is shitty. Yeah. Let's stop doing this.
It took something so Unnameably awful.
I mean, yeah. First of all, cast people who can act, please.
Yes, please.
And yeah, moving on.
Moving on.
Can I change the conversation a little bit before we shift over to talking about when magic really doesn't work for us? I thought there was one final example of magic working on many levels that I thought perhaps you could provide some wisdom and insight on. And this is a game that I have never played, but I have watched you enjoy intensely. And it happens to be a game which received a lot more mainstream attention in 2016 due to the release of Pokemon Go. So yes, I'm asking you, Tony, to talk about Pokemon. Like, is it magic? Can we call it magic? And what works about gaming magic in the way that Pokemon does?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because, and here's where it gets convoluted for me. Because we see in the Pokemon universe that technology exists, and it's sort of like our world, the technological level of our world, computers, cell phones, or cell phone analogs, freaking hologram cell phones that people carry around in their pockets, TV, cars, all the things that we're familiar with. Just also, there are Pokemon, and they are captured by balls, and they have bizarre powers. And are they magical powers? Probably not, maybe. Are they captured and, translated into energy that technology can then store? Is that magic? I don't know. And see, this is a good example of something in which the magic, air quotes, is in the background and isn't ever really fully explained. And, you don't need it to in order to be enjoyable. Pokemon is not something that is probably going to dig deeply into how Pokemon are stored and how they use their powers and what, sort of the magical cosmic microwave background of the universe is. And that's fine. It doesn't honestly bother me. But, I do wonder that. What is the magi technology of the Pokemon universe, and how does it interact with actual technology? And I think it's something that is kind of specific to games. And I expect that it actually isn't unique to games, but I encounter it most often in games. I'm thinking here also of the Tales series of video games, specifically Tales of Symphonia, which is the first one I played way back when, 12 years ago or something now. I don't actually want to think of how long ago it was. But this, sort of intermingling of technology and magic. And I think what sets it off for video games is the interactability. You can see it on screen, you can read about it in a book, you can sort of see some explanations or hear some, but it's kind of different when you're doing it yourself. The act of throwing a Pokeball, even though you're just pressing the A button, and then hammering, because you learned in the original generation that that's how you could get the Pokemon to stay in the ball, hammering that A button. Anyway, that sort of action seems like it kind of makes it a little different. For me at least, it makes me wonder questions what is the magic of this universe? How does this work? And I know a lot of people never think that. And you don't have to think it. It's fine. But, yeah, it's a good question. And I rambled, but I don't have a good answer. And that's essentially
Rambling
what it comes down
to. And perhaps it's compulsive gameability, or playability, I suppose I should say, is partially a result of stripping down some of those explanations which otherwise might clutter up the game. You don't necessarily want to read an essay about Pokemon in-game while you're playing.
Right.
That there are other game systems and platforms which use explanations and essays and descriptions as a guiding principle, but they have a different tenor and a different pace at which you progress through them, at least in my limited experience. So
right, and it opens up all kinds of questions too. Once you think about how the magic or not magic in Pokemon operates, then you have to think about what happens to Pokemon when they go into the Pokeballs? Are they conscious? What happens when they go into the computers? Are they forever alone? How do you possibly have something like Mr. Mime running around?
Okay, don't think about it too much, because you will then go down a very deep rabbit hole, which, by the way, we haven't talked about Lewis Carroll, but now we have. Lewis Carroll's great. So let's pose that as an open question to our listeners. If you have any opinions on whether Pokemon is magic or not, please hop online and tweet at us, or hop on our blog and our website and let us know how you feel, because we care about that. And so then we can pivot perhaps to talking about how magic doesn't work sometimes, and how we feel about that. So are there some texts that leap out at you as kind of failures of imagination in terms of magic? We talked about failures of imagination in dystopia. Yeah. Let's talk about it in magic.
I'm just going to go straight for the beast. Harry Potter. And I mean that because I grew up with Harry Potter. I was 11 or 12 when the first book came out. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I like those books for so many reasons. Obviously, we devoted we devoted half a podcast to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. It was an enjoyable movie, etc., etc., etc. Caveats out of the way, I think that its handling of magic is not really good. And I think that this comes to the fore when you sort of take it out of its comfort zone. And by comfort zone, I mean Hogwarts. Like, maybe we get a really limited view of how a 13-year-old or even a 17-year-old is going to go to school and learn some relatively safe spells and maybe learn some magical theory. And I think that that's handled well. But once we get out of that world, when we see, for example, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the members of the Order of the Phoenix fighting the Death Eaters, especially when it's represented on screen. Obviously, the book and the movie are two different properties, and I don't want to confuse them. However, I don't feel that either did a particularly good job of showing how magic actually works out in the world, why it works, in what ways it works. And that was only compounded by something like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. When you get the Deus Ex Machina, I guess Deus Ex Thunderbird in this, Thunderbird Ex Machina in this case.
That sounds very dramatic.
It does. Maybe that's a good name for a band. Anyway, the important thing is you basically have this giant reset button that happens because of the Thunderbird at the end of the movie, and like magic, something, I don't know. And I don't want to pick out that moment in particular, but rather just to say things like apparating and the Aurors and magic in general in New York City in the 20s, just all of it sort of fell apart. And I don't want to call out the Harry Potter series and associated books and whatnot, because I like them, but I don't think, or rather I should say, magic is so vague and yet such a central part of the text that it really needed to do more. Maybe not in terms of Harry, and maybe this is something that's coming. Maybe you will see it in future movies about adult wizards. But it just feels kind of poorly planned. And I want to contrast that, actually, before I turn it over to you.
Sure.
With Lord of the Rings, which is also fairly vague in terms of what magic is. Is elf magic the same as the magic that Gandalf can use? Is it sort of divine? Is it natural? Like, does it come from the natural world? Like, we know it's kind of a part of the fabric of the universe, but is it all part of the fabric of the universe? Is all magic the same? And like you said, you get a lot more of that outside of, like, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. But in terms of how they work in those central texts, I think that vagueness is actually subtlety. And subtlety works really well for magic in Lord of the Rings, in the same way that vagueness does not work well for magic in Harry Potter.
Well, perhaps one of the strong points of Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien had already imagined the architecture of his world, and he'd even plotted out intricately the mythological history of this world. So the Silmarillion, I think, satisfactorily explains why the world works the way it does. However, most people do not read the Silmarillion, because what the Lord of the Rings is to the Hobbit, the Silmarillion is to the Lord of the Rings in terms of increasing the density and archness of the dialogue and the language. It just gets worse in the Silmarillion. And I say that in love because it was actually my favorite of Tolkien's books as a kid. And so Harry Potter started from scratch, and it started on the back of a napkin, which is an awesome origin story for a series.
For sure.
I really respect everything, well, maybe not everything, but the vast majority of what J.K. Rowling has done as an author and as a human being. She's, generally speaking, one of the least problematic, very successful authors out there on the planet. However, I think it's an argument worth making that for a series of, okay, no, don't shoot me in the leg for not knowing the number. Is it 5 books in Harry Potter?
7.
Don't ever trust me again. The 7 books in Harry Potter that I only ever read once. There's enough page space there. There's enough world and paper to play with that she should have paid some attention to the stuff going through, and it shouldn't have felt remedial. And I think the problem I have with the way that the surrounding architecture of how the Harry Potter world operates is that it comes when it's needed and it feels very convenient. So we get this flying car driving scene in, is it Chamber of Secrets? Which actually explains, it actually explains quite a lot about how the Ministry of Magic works and how adults treat infractions against, the rules. And like, that's good, but it only comes when they break the rule. And so there's not a lot of foreshadowing, there's not a lot of consistency. Does Dumbledore travel by apparating, or does he travel by Phoenix? Like, why have both? Like, is it just the drama of the Phoenix bursting into flame that's, like, super cool and you wanted to travel that way? But that seems like an awful waste of time, and the Phoenix is alive. So,
for sure.
I don't know. Like, there are moments where I'm like, this is just happening because you thought it would be cool right now. Yeah. Like, you thought of this 5 minutes ago.
There's one moment in particular that I want to identify as, I think, kind of the example of where magic falls apart for me in the Harry Potter universe. And it actually happens in one of my favorite chapters of any of the books, because the scene is so tightly written. But it's in the 4th book, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire.
Okay.
It's in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom taught by, in that book, Mad-Eye Moody, who, spoiler for a book that came out more than 10 years ago, is not actually Mad-Eye Moody. But he's teaching the students in Harry's class about the 3 unforgivable curses. They're called that because the use of any one of the curses on another human being is enough to earn the user a life sentence in the wizarding prison. So there, and I could go and say, like, we see these spells being used all over the place in the subsequent books, not necessarily just by the bad guys either, but also by the good guys, and there are no ramifications for them. And I'm willing to forgive that. I'm willing to forgive those unforgivable curses because, we're shown a war, etc. The moment, actually, I wanted to call out from that scene is when Mad-Eye Moody tells the class, or I should say the faux Mad-Eye Moody tells the class they could all take out their wands, point them at him, yell the killing curse, and he doubts that he would get so much as a nosebleed because it's something that requires a fair bit of power behind it. And I remember, and this moment stuck with me because it's so interesting, because it's almost getting at how magic works in the Harry Potter universe. There needs to be power behind magic. Is that, like, magical power? Is it power of knowledge? Is it power of experience?
Power of conviction?
Like, I'm throwing power of conviction. I'm throwing around the word power here, and it doesn't make any more sense than when it's used there. But, it's one of those moments that it feels like, even if it wasn't addressed in that scene, and again, I think that scene is tightly done, very good. I wouldn't change anything about it. But addressing this idea that there's some sort of power of something required for magic to work or to work well is something that we absolutely should have seen and sort of see in little bits throughout the Harry Potter universe. For example, in the 5th book, Order of the Phoenix, when Harry is trying to learn occlumency to shut his mind against foreign invasion, he's not very good at it. But why isn't he very good at it? Again, the book sort of goes there, but not directly. We sort of like dance around it a lot. And that's where this vagueness that I don't particularly like with respect to magic in the Harry Potter universe, that's where I'm getting this idea from. That we sort of look at it, but, where I'm willing to accept some vagueness in other works and call it subtlety, I'm less willing to accept it here because they're at a frickin' school of magic.
Like, they should be explaining this to their students, and we should be getting some of the explanation ourselves as listeners and readers and audience members. Of course
they should. Like, granted, we missed the final year at Hogwarts, but are you telling me that they learned literally everything there was behind the magical system in that final year? Like, what the hell were the first 6 years for? So they could turn, like, sparrows into buttons?
Well, I don't think based on... Okay, who is the divination professor?
Professor Trelawney.
Okay, given the fact that they were totally okay with Professor Trelawney teaching classes, like, I don't think efficiency and efficacy was really the goal of an education at Hogwarts.
Oh no. See, I love Dumbledore, but he's a terrible administrator.
He's not just a terrible administrator, he's a terrible, like, evaluator of human potential and human nature, and he's kind of horrible to Harry. I've read a lot of essays lately in which they talk about how truly problematic Dumbledore is, and actually Rowling has totally fessed up to the fact that, like, she never really saw him as a fully good guy. So, yeah, like, get out there, read some of the literature of Harry Potter if you're interested in the subject, and, we'll come back to talking about Harry Potter multiple times on this podcast. Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning that there are other texts out there that we have problems with. We don't want to spend so much time dissing Harry Potter that you forget that we really don't.
I apologize to J.K. Rowling. I think she's awesome, and I just have a lot of feelings about things.
And I have to say, I am personally a huge fan of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. So, I happen to think that she's capable of seeing the flaws and the holes in what she's written and addressing them head on in future texts. So we might see some very wonderful and creative things from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, episodes 2 through 7, or however many there's going to be.
Right.
So let's talk about some of those other texts. What are some other texts in which magic falls short?
I brought up the Oz books earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly want to mention them as ones in which magic falls short, but as ones in which magic was kind of not codified in a genre or as a genre in a way that it is or has been 100 years later. So the Oz books, I mean, as much as they're kind of like allegories for socialism, are they fairy tales? Are they modern-ish fairy tales? Are they avowedly not fairy tales that just have characters who have fairy powers or are fairies? I think that's an interesting question. And, I don't mention this, again, because it works poorly, but as a way in which I think it could work poorly if it was updated. In the same way that, say, going from the ring cycle, which I believe, and you may know the answer to this better than I do, but I believe the ring cycle inspired a lot of the Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien really updated it and changed it and made a really interesting immersive world. Whereas I'm afraid that something like the Oz books or, the Oz property, if it's revisited, it is very timely. And, just sort of calling it a fantasy or updating it into a modern fantasy maybe doesn't capture the same genre or the same wonder that the original books had, because they weren't really relying on a cultural consciousness that was familiar with fantasy as we think of it today.
Sure. And I think perhaps cultural consciousness is one of the markers of successful magic for me. I think To call out the elephant in the room, a property we haven't talked about yet is Lev Grossman's The Magicians, which is, I think its second season as an adaptation on the Sci-Fi Channel is premiering very, very soon, like in the next couple of days. It might even have premiered by the time we get this episode online. And this is a series which, in so many ways, is brilliant, and the books are just flying off of our library shelves. People are devouring them like nothing else. And in a lot of ways, Grossman is very clearly stealing wholesale from Narnia in an honoring way. Like, it's not calling out Narnia as something terrible, or, you know, Narnia has its flaws. And I think Grossman was aware of those, and he actually capitalizes on some of those. But this is a series where magic is ritualized, where you are in a school setting. It's a graduate school, so it's older protagonists than we get in a lot of these school setting magic worlds. And they use their hands. So if you can't use your hands, you can't do magic. And they have very complicated finger motions. So imagine how painful it is to be an arthritic in this universe. But at the same time, you've got these jumps into a parallel other world, the world of Fillory, that are happening. And Fillory is essentially Narnia gone wrong. And the series really stumbles when it goes to Fillory, not because there isn't a lot of rich material there, but because the cultural consciousness that's really the bread and butter of people who love the show is strongest in the school setting, because it allows this series producers and directors and Lev Grossman himself to dive into like the existential anxieties that we have as people entering adulthood with no idea of who we are and what we want to do with ourselves and our skills. And it's wonderful. If you're a graduate student looking for an escape from your graduate studies, The Magicians is not a bad choice. And so that's a series where there are stumbles, but it manages to perhaps still be good enough to stick with in the long term. But there are also series I think really struggle to set themselves back on a footing where they're worth diving into. And a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but I do not enjoy Terry Brooks and the Shannara series. And the way that magic is enacted in that world has a big part of, you know, it's a big part of why I don't enjoy Terry Brooks. And I think it's because magic is this cool thing that allows Terry Brooks to move the plot forward, or it's the excuse for the story to exist in the first place, but he doesn't really do anything with it on the cultural consciousness level. And perhaps it's because I'm reading this series long after it was written, but that's my take on it. Cultural consciousness is a critical component of making magic work, either as the cosmic background radiation or as a ritualized system that you learn, like in a structured school environment, like in Harry Potter or The Magicians.
Final thoughts you want to bring up? Anything we haven't talked about that we desperately and definitely should?
I'm not certain that we can really fundamentally point to what does magic have to have in order to be satisfying. Like, I think we can point to a constellation of things that we like and enjoy and that build to a successful magical world and magical property. But I don't know that we can say, here are these 10 things, and if you have these in your novel, it will be a glorious success as a
totally
magical
not.
world.
No.
And
no.
I'm not certain we can even say truly when magic becomes problematic, except for when it's clearly and unequivocally racist or sexist or fetishizing its characters or plot or air quotes, cultures, etc. You know, I think that those are, again, like there's a constellation of things that we can point to and say, this is clearly not good. But I don't know that we can say that there's like a Rubicon that you cross either way.
And, right, if there was some sort of like magical list of what makes a book with magic work, like probably every book would do that. But, you know, if every book that featured magic went into how it works and how to utilize it and, you know, the intricacies to the extent that Patrick Rothfuss does in The Name of the Wind, it would drive me crazy. Like, I wouldn't want that over and over again. And yet I appreciate it so much more because he invests so much time in it, and it's relatively rare.
Well, the good news is that The Name of the Wind is going to be adapted, I believe, for television, and it's going to be adapted by Lin-Manuel Miranda. So if you happen to like Hamilton the musical, or you happen to like this complete cinnamon roll of a human being that is Lin-Manuel Miranda, then you should definitely stay tuned for information on that. We'll probably, drool over it a little bit when it comes to fruition, but for now it's probably not worth spending too much time on because it's still in the very early stages. However, if you are looking for a list of magical systems and the intricacies of how they work, if you want the Spark Notes, Cliff Notes version of all of these different worlds and how their magics work, then hop on IO9. There's a wonderful piece written by Charlie Jane Anders, and this was published back in 2011, so it doesn't include some of the more recent series, but it's essentially a spreadsheet of the rules of magic as they play out in worlds like Abhorsen and American Gods, and there's quite a few in there that I don't even have personal affinity for or I haven't read. So, hop on there. I believe it was crowdsourced in some ways. It was at least crowd edited. So a lot of the credit goes to Charlie Jane Anders and IO9, but some of it also goes to the many followers of that website and their attention to detail. So I believe the article is simply called The Rules of Magic According to the Greatest Fantasy Sagas of All Time. So if you don't have time to go and read the entire Kingkiller Chronicles, you can at least read this, 4-page article on IO9.
You can also go to our website at www.imaginaries.us, where we will provide you with a truncated list of the works that we discuss in this podcast, as well as a link to that IO9 article, which is now on Gizmodo, that talks about or features this spreadsheet of the rules of magic. It's definitely worth checking out. Give it a look. It goes into much more detail than we could do even in the past hour. So,
and if you think that we have problematic ideas, good on you. We want to hear all about how you disagree with us and agree with us, and all of the shades of gray in between. Although don't watch 50 Shades, please, never, no. But you can reach us also. You can get a hold of us very quickly and easily on Twitter. Our handle is imaginary_pod.
Imaginary_pod.
We are here for you and all of your thoughts. Just not at 3 a.m. I do turn Twitter off at night. So have a lovely, lovely life, human beings who are listening to our podcast. And check us out online. We look forward to hearing from you. And go forth and magic the world up a little bit.
See you next time. Sorry.